Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. 2019 has been kicked off with repeated examples of extreme weather conditions. Australia has experienced record high temperatures. On the other hand, parts of the U.S. Midwest have been paralyzed due to a cold snap. Last week, Chicago experienced the coldest sub-zero temperatures since 1985 at -23. 21 deaths so far have been reported in the U.S. due to this frightening cold. But the question arises, will any of these events push world leaders towards making meaningful reforms? We discuss this with our guest today. We welcome to the show Vimlendu Jha, who's an environmentalist, joining us from India. We also have with us Dr. Benny Peiser, who is the director of Global Warming Foundation. He's joining us from London. And we have with us in the studios Dr. Melinda Gurr, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. Thank you all for joining us. Dr. Peiser, I'd like to begin with you. So as I mentioned in my introduction as well, Chicago did have a -23 degrees temperature, but it still didn't beat the record from 1985. So how much of what we are seeing can be attributed to climate change? Because the argument from the other side that might come is that this has been happening for quite some time now.
Well, what we're seeing are extreme weather events. They happen all over the world. They happen every year. Wherever you go, there will be some records broken, whether it's a cold record or a hot record. Obviously, we live in a warming world, and so you would expect more heat waves. But by and large, what we are seeing every year are extreme weather events. So we need to be absolutely sure that we differentiate between weather, which is a one-off, and climate, which is a long-term trend.
Yes, and Dr. Peiser, it's great that you mentioned that here, because something that many people get confused with is weather and climate. And for that, I'd like Vimlendu to explain to us exactly what the difference is.
From a short period of time, that's what for many of us is actually weather in that sense. And of course, climate, when we talk about global warming, almost, when you talk about erratic weather conditions right now, and of course, what you see on the screen is actually snow and ice, and it's actually cold. And then a common person would perhaps think that, when we talk about global warming, how come we are seeing so much of snow in that sense? As the person before me said, that we are actually talking about in the global warming era or in climate change era, we talk about erratic weather conditions. So when there is a change in climate, which is a change in the overall temperature of our planet, of our atmosphere in that sense, it leads to erratic weather patterns. And it actually affects many things. It affects the lifespan of species. It affects our agricultural policies. Patterns. We're talking about heat waves. And also, when we talk about what is this, is it mere inconvenience?
Dr. Melinda, here we're talking about how there are extreme weather conditions, but a lot of scientists are saying that even though that this polar vortex was experienced in the U.S., in the future it might not seem as likely. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, what they were saying is correct. What we're going to see is more extreme and more erratic weather patterns. With ice melting up at the global north, at the Arctic pole, it creates these vortexes that are coming down. And so, it could happen somewhere else, at another time. So it's just going to become increasingly unpredictable. And so it's troubling the lack of concern or the lack of understanding that some of our world leaders have about the issue, since they don't seem to fundamentally understand how this works.
Yeah. Definitely, that is an issue. If you confuse science with your own facts, then you conflate both facts and issues, and then it becomes a big problem. Dr. Peiser, you in an article in a research paper talked about climate realism, and it's the acknowledgement of the fact that there are many shades of gray when it comes to climate research. Could you tell us about that, and what are the main issues confronting climate research these days?
Well, I think the biggest uncertainty that the international community faces is the extent and the speed of global warming. For the time being, the warming trend over the last 50 or 70 years has been much slower as most models predicted. So it's about half of what the IPCC predicted in 1990. And I guess that explains partially why the international community is not taking this issue that seriously, because they can see that although it has been warming, the warming is very gradual. So people say, well, it will be much worse in the future, but this hasn't happened. There is no acceleration of the warming. The warming is very gradual, it's very slow. And so politicians, that's what they do when they see it's not really that urgent. And the other issue, of course, is, and you will understand that in Pakistan, many countries have huge energy issues. They think about how to power their countries, how to avoid blackouts. And for the time being, the cheapest form of energy remains fossil fuel based. So you have this double dilemma.
Yes, and in the current system, when we're seeing that fossil fuel emissions is something that needs to be reduced, but countries are not taking enough measures towards it, what do you think is happening on the policy end there?
Well, as I said, it's threefold. First of all, fossil fuel energy is the most reliable and the cheapest form still available to most countries. And of course, Pakistan and India are classic examples where cheap fossil fuel energies are still playing the vast majority of energy production. And that is true for the global energy mix as well. It's about 80% of the energy mix is still fossil fuel based. And most energy analysts think it won't change that much in the next 20 years. The second is, as I said, the warming hasn't actually accelerated to the extent as was predicted by the climate models or climate scientists. So politicians don't see an urgent need because they say, well, it's not that bad. And the third is there's really no public pressure on governments to do much because economic issues are dominating the political debates, and the climate issue is a side issue.
And but Dr. Peiser, here we saw in 2018 specifically many protests all the world, in Australia and so in Brussels, many students coming out protesting against climate change. Is there really not enough pressure on policy makers?
No, well, because you have the politicians don't care about protests, they care about elections, and most green parties who take climate change so seriously don't get a lot of votes. So the parties who win elections are the parties who promise people a good economy and cheap energy.
And here
that's the reality.
And here I'm curious to know how much of the research that is produced in regards to climate change, it's funded, of course, by people who have their own political leanings. How much does that influence the findings and the whole debate regarding climate change? I mean, can we find a true valid picture of the issue?
Well, I don't think there is a big issue because the vast majority of climate science is basically accepting the fact of climate change. There used to be in the past some researchers who got funded from the energy industry. Most of the funding nowadays in scientific research comes from the renewable energy sector, from the green energy sector. I don't think that plays a big role. I think the science is not a hurdle to policy making. The science, the IPCC, they are quite adamant. You know, the vast majority of scientists are more on the alarmist side of the argument. But politicians don't care about science and scientists. They care about elections and the economy. That is their priority, and that explains where we're going.
Yeah. Mr. Jha, we were talking about, Dr. Peiser here, how policy makers are not influenced by science. But can you tell us, maybe from an economics point of view, how climate change is damaging the economy? Maybe that would be a necessary wake-up call for policymakers.
Yeah. So first of all, we need to understand that what does climate change actually mean on real ground. So if you look at the drought conditions, the flood conditions, that we actually are having in our own region in India, Pakistan, for that matter, that clearly has an impact on overall GDP. The only problem is that because it takes a many years to really see the impact. So we dismiss it, we deny it. And when we see these erratic weather behaviors, we think these as one-off drought or one-off flood, and therefore we never connect the dots. And that's one of the main reasons why people or our policymakers or our governments are, very conveniently try to ignore climate change. It has a wide economic impact. It has a wide impact on agriculture. It has a very, very wide impact on marine biodiversity, and therefore on fishing communities, to tourism, to many of those things. So, climate change affects each and every one, be it industries, because industries are again dependent on natural resources. It affects agriculture, because agriculture largely is dependent on amount of water, the amount of rainfall, the amount of temperature. The cycles are getting disrupted in different parts of our world. We're talking about also how our rivers and our glaciers are suffering in many parts of the world in many ways. So economic impact, yes. Public health impact, yes. And of course, ecological impact is the primary reason.
And with that, Mr. Jha, I'd like to take my question to Dr. Melinda here. So when we're talking from an anthropology point of view, and we're talking about climate change, how does that impact displacement? How does that impact humans at a very human level?
Well, we're expected to have millions of climate refugees soon, right? So it's really quite alarming that there's not policies in place and people aren't taking it that seriously. If you look at places around the world, for example, in Brazil, they're planning on opening up the Amazon for further deforestation and mining activities. And so I'm quite worried about that in the future of a livable planet, So those are the lungs of the earth, and without taking into consideration the importance of the system as a whole, we could definitely be in for trouble.
And a lot of ecological disruption has a domino effect, am I right? It's going to keep on swirling into a big problem there. Dr. Peiser, we talked about how, of course, there are physical manifestations of climate change here, but a lot of research polls amongst the general public exhibits that public sentiments are geared towards believing that climate change is a natural phenomena and humans don't have a lot to do with it, whereas almost 97% of the scientists are on the consensus that humans are responsible for climate change. Can you tell us about that debate and how to convince those individuals who believe humans are not the problem here?
Well, that's a difficult debate, because there is this discrepancy between the scientific community, where there's a much bigger consensus on the science, and the public, which tends to be much more skeptical. I mean, we see this here in Britain, that despite 20 or 30 years of raising the alarm and saying the end is near, the majority of Britons still don't accept that climate change is primarily man-made. They still think that it is partly human caused and partly due to natural factors. And I sometimes wonder why that is, given that, every day the BBC shouts it from the rooftops, and most of the media are writing about it, and still the majority of Britons remain skeptical. So I wonder whether it is a growing reaction to rising energy prices, which is much more of a concern to the average Briton than climate change.
Yeah.
They find it difficult to heat their homes in the winter. They are struggling with the money they have as it is. And energy prices, as a result of many of the policies adopted to ameliorate climate change, are costing them. So I wonder whether there is this kind of response due to policies that hurt people and hurt families. And they say, well, therefore, we don't believe the science.
Yeah. I'll take my last question to Mr. Vimlendu here. Vimlendu, what can you tell us about how it's important to convince people of this, and what can be done to do so? What needs to be done to change the public sentiments?
See, I think evidence-based campaign is extremely important. There has, as Dr. Peiser was talking about, that there are larger compelling reasons that the poor people have to not believe or not change their lifestyle. The sustainable lifestyle is not a cheaper lifestyle. When people are dying out of hunger, they'll actually address issues of poverty rather than issues of sustainable development or issues of planet in that sense. So we need to, and if you look at Paris protests are a very important example that, why people were protesting against a hike in fuel prices, and because of course the government was addressing issues of climate change in that sense. So I think it needs to be deconstructed. The government needs to really incentivize these processes. I think it's not the onus of climate change mitigation cannot lie on the poorest of the poor. It's the rich, it's the system, it's the governments that need to behave in a proper way to really solve this problem. We cannot, let the poorest of the poor people suffer, and poorest of the poor people who have to change their lifestyles. The rich needs to behave, the governments need to behave.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Melinda Gurr, for joining us here and talking to us about this important issue. And Dr. Peiser, back to you. So what's something that Mr. Jha was talking about was how the onus lies with the governments. And you have said before that, of course, policy makers don't care about that. And that definitely became manifest when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And I want to ask you, what happens when the leader of the free world does that?
Well, what happens, people begin to realize that the US is now an energy superpower. It will produce more oil as Saudi Arabia and Russia together. And as a result of the shale revolution, the US will not leave that in the ground. So they've decided for domestic and geopolitical reasons that energy will play a huge role in their international policies, and that is their top priority. What the rest of the world makes of it, I don't know. I think it's a realization that there is no international consensus on what to do. Many countries and many governments pay lip service anyhow. They sign up to things, but they don't really mean to do much about it. After all, the Paris Agreement is a voluntary agreement. It doesn't force anyone to do anything. And so one thing is for sure, the pressure by European countries on the developing world, like India, Pakistan, to cut their emissions is morally unjustified. And I think that is part of the problem, the divide between the wealthy countries who became rich on the basis of cheap energy are now telling the poor countries, don't use the energy that made us rich.
Yeah. Definitely, and with that, I do want to take this point over to Dr. Melinda. How do you see this debate, where the richer countries are saying that we have these quotas for emissions, but we have already gotten to the stage we needed to get at? How unfair is that?
It's incredibly unfortunate and frustrating, because I feel like at least before Trump came into power, there was a bit of consensus. Like, we weren't living up to our agreements and to our ideals, but at least there was an idea. Like, people were trying to work forward for better policies. And to put the onus on the poorer countries, it is despicable, because the problem lies with the United States and with these larger countries. And so what we're seeing currently right now is, the US is increasingly being involved in, Venezuelan politics, their oil. They're opening up indigenous land in the west of the United States in the desert for mining, which was, previously protected by the Obama administration. You see increasing interference in the region as a whole, and so it's quite troubling.
So interfering in that sense, and then trying to strong arm developing nations into doing something that is unfair definitely is very problematic. Dr. Peiser, something that you talked about, and we have been talking about this recently, and from that I want to ask you, all these conferences that we witnessed, Davos being the latest, where climate change was talked about passionately, do you feel optimistic that in the future policymakers will change their attitudes or not?
They might, but that depends on how climate change evolves. I think if climate change continues to be a very slow, gradual, and low trend, as we've seen over the last 50, 70 years, where instead of rising by, let's say, 3 degrees this century, it might only rise by 1 degree this century, I think nothing is going to happen. I think governments will accept that we will be able to cope with a 1 degree rise in the 21st century, and they will simply encourage more adaptation to a very, very slow rise in temperature. However, if global warming was to accelerate, as most climate scientists predict and most climate activists predict, then the whole policy debate changes. And also internationally, there would be much more pressure to do more about it. For the time being, that is not happening, but I wouldn't rule it out that it might happen.
Okay, and with that, we also are joined by Francois Gemenne, who is a specialist of environmental and migration dynamics. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me ask you this, Francois. When we're talking about policy making, what is the biggest hindrance, in your opinion, that is causing for the prevention of environmental reforms?
Well, at the moment, clearly the biggest hindrance is the lack of international cooperation and the lack of willingness from governments to cooperate on global issues. Clearly, we've seen in recent years a rise of nationalism and populism, certainly in Europe, but also in countries like the United States or Russia. And clearly the problem right now is that the world is increasingly connected through global issues, be they climate change or migration, but governments seem less and less likely to cooperate on these issues because they believe that these issues would be better tackled, would be better addressed within the national borders, which I think is an absolute nonsense. But unless we have more global cooperation on these issues, I'm afraid that we will not be able to address these issues seriously.
Okay, so also we were talking about earlier about the Paris Accord and the agreement, and of course the US has pulled out of it. But what do you think is going to become the outcome? 2020 is the date given for when the rule book will come into play, and where do you see that heading?
I think the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement is a complete disaster. I hear that some voices have said that maybe it was not such a big deal and that the withdrawal of the US could be compensated by further action by civil society or municipalities. I think what we need to understand is that the Paris Agreement is first and foremost a political agreement, and that when the US pulls out of that agreement, it sends a terrible signal to the other signatory countries, and it tells them that basically it is okay to come and go within or outside of the agreement as one pleases. And it sends a terrible signal to the markets in terms of the fragility of the agreement. So what is likely to happen, I'm afraid, is that the commitments will not be upgraded because we need an upgrade of these commitments, but it seems extremely difficult to ask other countries to accelerate when the US is doing a U-turn on this. And
Francois, hold on to that thought. I want to play a video when he exactly pulls out of the agreement just to give more perspective to our viewers. Watch this.
But begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out, but we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. And if we can, that's great.
Francois, coming back to you, he mentioned the taxpayers here. So how is he exactly billing on climate change being an expensive hoax?
Well, I think it's a wrong calculation to think that it would be expensive. Clearly, the issue of the cost was brought forward by Donald Trump in his speech and was given as one of the main reasons for the US to pull out. But the reality is that the countries that do not anticipate on climate risk and who do not start right now transitioning outside of fossil fuels will be the losers at the end of the game. It is a really short-sighted view to think that climate change and that investing against climate change represents a cost. One should see it as an investment. And the countries that will not make this investment will be the losers of the future.
And with that, I'd like to ask Dr. Peiser a question. You mentioned earlier how since climate change is gradual and it's not manifesting in the way alarmists point towards it being unfolding, do you think that this alarmism that's created, these apocalyptic claims that are made, are in fact counterproductive?
Partly they are counterproductive when they are actually shown to be wrong. I mean, short-term predictions like, children won't know what snow is anymore because of global warming. That was one of the predictions published about 10, 15 years ago. But partly because people get completely used to it. They say, oh, we've heard that 1,000 times. People become cynic about it as well because they think people are always exaggerating. Can't we have the truth for a change? So alarmism is perhaps as undermining this whole issue as complete denial. It's a kind of the other side of the coin. And what we've been arguing for is what is necessary is a very clear, rational, and truthful assessment of the situation. And that means that you don't exaggerate and you don't underrate the risk. Yeah. You have to look at it from a realistic assessment. And what I would say to Mr. Forgotten his name.
Francois.
Yes. He says it's not a cost, it's an investment. Well, if it were that easy, we wouldn't have that problem. It is because these policies do have a cost and they do are a burden to people using energy that we have a problem. If it were easy, if it were cheaper, then everyone would do it and everyone would move to a low carbon economy and we would solve the problem from, within years. But it is because of the costs and the economic consideration that we have this debate.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Benny Peiser, for joining us. On that note, I would like to go back to Francois and talk about something, exactly the point that Dr. Peiser here mentioned. We saw the Yellow Vest protests in France and how rampant they were. So, of course, that is the case. And that's what many people argue, that there is a huge economic cost that burdens the poorest of the poor. So how do we reconcile that with the fact that it is an investment in for a more sustainable future?
Nobody says that it will be easy. Nobody says that it will be cheap. And nobody says that it will go without problems. And certainly it is a big effort to make. And I think one of the crux of the matter here is to connect these issues of environmental policies with these issues of social justice. If both are not tackled and are not addressed together, then we are likely to see other movements like the Yellow Vest in other parts of the world protesting against what they perceive as unfair taxes, unfair costs, or unfair burden. And I think this is really the reason why we need to stop considering climate change and climate policies as technical issues, and we need to bring them back into the democratic debate so that our society can freely decide what they want to do and how they want to invest for the future.
And that's a great point to end this segment. Stay with us, Francois, while we take a short break. And when we return, we're going to start with another story. Welcome back to Indus Special. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that there are approximately 68.5 million forcibly displaced individuals in the world due to violence or conflict. Amidst this, the European housing crisis worsens. In Britain, a researcher suggests that current number of homeless people, which is 320,000, will double by 2041. And in the U.S., the homeless population has increased consecutively for a second year. Now, shelter should be a basic human right for any individual. But what we are seeing is that people are living in extremely unsafe conditions and increasingly are becoming more and more displaced. To talk about this and explore this issue further, we are still in conversation with Francois Gemenne, Dr. Melinda Gurr, and now we're also joined by Aamirah Patel, who is a researcher at TRT World Research Center. Thank you so much for joining us. Aamirah, let me start off with you. How important is the right to housing?
The right to housing is an essential human right. So with regards to fulfilling our basic set of needs as human beings, the right to housing is one that's integral, and often it's one that's missed out. You know, in the midst of housing crises globally, we often see a lack of emphasis on, you know, the right to shelter and the right to housing, which is why we see so many individuals in camps, in tents, often on the borders when they do flee war, or even in the context of developed nations such as the UK and the US, where homelessness is a huge problem. You see many people sleeping rough.
Yeah. And with that, Aamirah, I'd like to ask Dr. Melinda here, when we're discussing homelessness, how important is it to premise the discussion on the homelessness? Being homeless is not a choice. It's not something that people have gotten themselves into, in order to evoke empathy and in order to have policymakers thinking from a human angle.
Right, so there's a lot of factors that go into causing homelessness, correct? So we want to think about structural things like the lack of affordable housing, the lack of subsidized housing, the lack of controls on rental rates, displacement due to violence and war, correct? Other things like, you know, in the US, it's like a very large number of the population that's homeless are veterans, you know, so they're people with mental health issues and substance abuse problems, you know. So there's a number of problems that go into making this kind of crisis, and you know, it depends on who you are. So it's very complicated, and there's no reason to blame the victim for this because it's a challenge.
Could you tell us more about the rates of homelessness rising in the United States? What's causing that? What's the main factor driving it? And what is the government doing to respond to it?
Well, I feel like the government's response has been very inadequate. What we've seen is, you know, rental rates, there's very little regulation of rents. So you can raise it theoretically, you know, outpacing the CPI or anything. So that's a challenge. You also see stagnating wages in terms of jobs. You see a lot of people with student loans, crippling loan debt. They can't afford to buy homes of their own. So there's a huge challenge in the United States, but a lot of it's becoming, you know, because there's not enough investments in affordable housing and subsidized housing. So when I used to work with people with the federal housing program in 2008, they had a waiting list in Salt Lake City of 9 years to obtain subsidized housing. So that wasn't good enough at all. If you look in other countries in the world, like Brazil, you know, you see 10% of the population meets the criteria for homelessness, which is a bit broader since it can mean overcrowding, substandard conditions, living in areas of risk. So unfortunately, the responses have been inadequate.
And can you tell us, when you're comparing that from different parts of the world, how has homelessness been impacted differently in different regions from an anthropologist's perspective? Is it because of the urbanization, moving towards more cities, that's causing this technological progress? Because that's often used as a reason for why more and more people are out of jobs and then they lose their homes. So what have been the cultural trends leading to this?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with urbanization, absolutely. You know, cities are the places where there's educational facilities, there's jobs, there's growth there, and so people tend to be leaving the rural areas. You know, and the way that the cities are developing isn't necessarily sustainable. So you've got different patterns of growth. In Lahore, you see suburbanization, people are leaving and they keep going further and further out. In many other places in the world, you see, you know, the city centers are attracting people, and poor people that traditionally lived in those neighborhoods are getting kicked out and being sent to the peripheries. So it's a challenge, and it looks different, you're right, in different parts of the world.
Okay. With that, I'd like to take my next question to Mr. Francois. Francois, can you tell us how the migration crisis in Europe, but also the conflicts all across the world, have exacerbated the problem of displacement? And can you just give us a true human picture of it? What exactly happens when a person leaves their home, the pain that's caused, and what happens when they cannot find shelter where they're trying to seek refuge?
Well, clearly what Europe has witnessed in the past few years was a massive influx of migrants and refugees coming from different parts of the world for different reasons. And so far the European governments have been pathetically unable to find a common response and a long-term response to these issues, which has exacerbated populism in European member states, and which has made conditions extremely difficult for refugees and migrants coming in. Many of them were left on the streets, had difficulties to register, and many of them are also trying to reach another country, but are unable to do so because of the Dublin regulation that forces them to be stuck in the first European countries that they've crossed.
And that's definitely a very problematic issue with the whole European migration crisis, the Dublin regulation. But when we're talking more broadly, even outside of Europe, a recent report by the World Health Organization said that at least 29 children died due to the overcrowding of a refugee camp in northeastern Syria due to hypothermia. Can you tell us about the issues that people face exactly, the challenges they face, and more particularly, which groups of people are the most vulnerable?
Well, clearly, as often, the most vulnerable groups are obviously children and women. But what needs to be, I think, highlighted is the fact that the refugee journeys these days are usually spread over a very long time and different countries. So there are different steps on the migration journey, and during these different steps, they usually face violence and sometimes even torture. Some are being put into slavery. And then there is, of course, the high risks of crossing the Mediterranean. At the moment, there are no safe and legal routes to access Europe, and therefore they are due to take boats to pay enormous amounts of money to smugglers and traffickers. And when they reach Europe, many of them believe that it's the end of the journey, but they will face further difficulties in Europe.
And Francois, when we're talking about this, what can you tell us about how stringent border controls, they are impacting this the human lives even further? Tell us a little more about that.
Clearly, the policy of the European government so far has been to close the borders even further, with the hope that this would deter migration and discourage people from trying to cross the border. It has had clearly the opposite effects, and the result has been that it has encouraged the traffic and the smuggling of people and made prices more expensive, and it has not discouraged people from crossing the border. If people have to cross the border and are desperate to do so, they will do so at any cost. So the effects of closing the external borders of Europe has only been to make migration more difficult, more costly, and more dangerous. And clearly, the death rate in the Mediterranean remained absolutely appalling.
And what would your response be to the concept of citizenship here, and how people say that when migrants come in an influx, it affects the citizens there? How would you respond to that?
I think that what we call an influx has to be relativized. I mean, Europe is a continent of 500 million inhabitants, and when you look at the share of migrants and refugees that Europe has taken in since the beginning of what we've called the crisis, it is actually a very limited number. If you compare it to the number of refugees being hosted in a country like Turkey, for example, which is now the country hosting the most refugees in the world, or countries in sub-Saharan Africa, clearly Europe has not done its share, and I think that this needs to be put into perspective.
Yeah, and with that point, I'd like to take my next question to Aamirah. Aamirah, when we're talking about the developed nations not having done enough, what can you tell us about that? Many of these countries were, if they were previously colonized, of course, they had a bad start, to say the least, and then whatever issues that they faced, how much of the onus does lie with developed nations to provide safe refuge?
I think I think there is a large onus, and I think there's a large rhetoric of anti-migration really growing when it comes to the sake of Europe, for example, which colonized a significant number of the countries that we're discussing at the moment. And as Francois already mentioned, we're seeing other countries, in the case of Istanbul, in the case of Turkey, taking in 3.5 million refugees from Syria, of which, a lot of the attention is given to Europe and its crisis, when actually, when you look at the numbers, that isn't the case. The same can be said of the Venezuelan situation at the moment. Significant numbers of the individuals fleeing are actually residing in neighboring South American nations. However, the rhetoric that the United States seems to be putting out is one of close our borders, they're coming, they're incoming, when in reality, the countries taking on the largest numbers of people, providing long-term support, providing residence permits, aren't being given the attention that they really do deserve. There's a model there, and I think there's a lot that the developed world, so to speak, could learn from these regions. And
Aamirah, we witnessed the longest U.S. government shutdown till date because of the wall that Trump wanted to erect. What do you think needs to be done by the public domain at moments such as these, when the government's definitely putting out a narrative which is anti-migration and it is not a human angle to the situation at all?
So this is when civil society organizations really need to come together and really challenge that rhetoric. In the case of the United States, there is a monopoly on the media, which means the rhetoric is difficult to challenge, and therefore there must be an onus on civil society organizations, those that are already doing the work. And we see that there's hundreds of people working to support migrants, to support refugees on the ground all over the United States, and it's time for them really to shout out and speak about what they're doing.
Yeah. And with that same point, I'd like to take my question here to Dr. Melinda. So what does the civil society need to do, but also the international organizations, especially the UN, need to do when they're seeing this pushback from governments towards migrants?
Well, this is heartbreaking because, there are organizations in the U.S. that have, from the civil society, that have organized on behalf of the immigrants. I think of No More Deaths is a really important NGO. And they put water and food supplies out in the desert to make sure that people don't die of hunger or thirst. But their activists have been getting arrested lately. And so it's having a really chilling effect on people that would like to help and would like to rally around. So it's difficult because the U.S. isn't very interested in cooperating with anyone at the moment. So, I don't know if there was any way to put pressure against them. It would be very useful.
Yeah. And also, not deviating from this debate that we're having about migration and displacement in that case, but also something that's important to put out there is the conversation regarding how homeless people, how displaced people are often seen to be more of a burden on the economy as opposed to productive individuals. Can you tell us what steps can be taken to reintegrate them back into the system?
Well, number one, you need to give them houses, because there's no way to build a life or to be a productive member of society or to get education if you're unhoused. This is the basic foundation of a person's life and citizenship. Yeah. So I think that's number one. It costs a lot less to house somebody than it does in the United States, for example, to incarcerate them, which is $40,000 a year. You can rehouse them for $10,000. Why would you do this unless you were, it's kind of a cruel system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about that, can you tell us how important it is for societies to change the stereotypical image they have of homeless people, that they're either involved in crime or, they're troublemakers, keep them out? Of course, we do see philanthropy in many instances emerging, even in Chicago in the cold, there were people coming out. But that can be done on a regular basis as well. Why does that have to be done in a crisis situation?
Right, and why should it be philanthropist? Because you can't depend on them. Who knows? So it should be something more of a structural, I think, change that needs to happen. In terms of the image of homeless people, it's not who you think. You know, it could just be a single mom who's having to sleep on the couch of a house, you know, at her friend's house and having to work 4 jobs. It could be that. It's, you know, there's a lot of different faces of homelessness, and people fall into hard times. Anybody in the United States, since we don't have socialized medicine, you're always one healthcare disaster away from homelessness.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge.
Yeah. Mr. Gemenne, while we're talking about stereotyping homeless people, also we've been hearing about migrant boats sinking, many people dying while they're trying to cross the ocean and sea. Why is this not taken into account when we think about people risking their lives coming to a place to stay? Why is that dampened by the international media?
Well, I think that there is a little bit of fatigue. The fact that the crisis has been going on since 2014, and obviously we see the same images continuously. And indeed, it is worrying that many people think that the crisis is now behind them, whereas it is not the case at all. If we look at the number of people who continue to die on an almost daily, if not week, on a daily basis in the Mediterranean. There is also, I think, the fact that people have a hard time relating to these migrants and refugees because they see them as foreigners, they see them as illegals, and they are often being described in the media as illegals. And I think that this creates a problem in the empathy that the people can have towards them and how they can relate toward them, because they consider them as the other rather than other human beings and part of themselves. And I think that one effort that should be made is also to show that migrants and refugees are just regular people, and they need to be shown in everyday life situation. They're always portrayed in situations of crisis, and therefore the reaction that people have towards this crisis is always an emotional reaction.
Yeah, and some argument, a suggestion that I heard, which was interesting in relation to this issue, was to create refugee cities. And I'm wondering what your take on that would be.
To me, these refugee cities would be like ghettos. I think the solution is not at all to park refugees in cities apart from the rest of the world that nobody would be able to see. I think what we need to do is further integrate these refugees and these migrants into cities and make them part of societies rather than parking them in some sort of ghettos that no one would like to see.
Definitely. And Aamirah, while we're on that, when we're talking about the dangers of the refugees and migrants, can you specifically shed light on how the specific dangers women are facing, and in terms of health, in terms of security, and children as well?
Yeah, so women and children are definitely the most vulnerable groups when fleeing conflict, even when they are internally displaced within a country. So in the case of Syria, for example, or even generally across the board, we see that they are at risk of sexual exploitation, gender-based violence. They're at higher risks of facing physical violence, along with essentially inheriting a burden of war and then of being able to sustain and maintain their families. So often when we look at women, they are looking after or solely now responsible for their entire household within a conflict society, or those who are leaving. So the external threats that any person would face are incredibly are more of an incredible threat when it comes to women and children.
And do we see rates of child trafficking also rising while there is more migrant displacement?
Yes, there's definitely a link between child trafficking and human trafficking with regards to active refugee crises. So, you often hear the stories of women who have been trafficked over 4 to 5 years, or children who have been trafficked. We have the generation of missing children, which are regarded in Europe as the Syrian refugees who have left, and now we've got millions of unaccounted for children a lot of which are expectedly now in the child trafficking industry. So there's a definite correlation between the two issues, unfortunately.
And Dr. Melinda, while we're talking about children here, I want to ask, what happens to the next generation when they're born in unsafe housing and when they are born in ghettos, as they're commonly referred to? What happens to the next generation?
It depends on what we're speaking of specifically, but it clearly can't be good for a child's development. I think, at worst case scenario, the children will die if they're exposed to unsafe drinking water, unsafe conditions. At worst, if they're not allowed stability and a place to grow and a place to thrive, I feel bad for the next generation growing up in these conditions. It's terrifying for them. So, I hope that they have the resilience to be all right.
Yeah. And the same point I'd like to take to Mr. Gemenne there. What can we say about children, migrant children? What are their futures like, and what do policymakers need to do to ensure that they have more safe futures?
At the moment, the future is dire for these children. I mean, speaking only of the situations on the borders of Europe, there are now hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children in refugee camps. Many of them do not receive proper formal education, which means that we are losing one generation, literally. This is a sacrificed generation, and that needs to be addressed right now. And this is the reason why it is extremely important to be more welcoming towards refugees and migrants and to integrate them as part of the society and to recognize their contribution to society.
Yeah. And my last question to Aamirah. So you mentioned earlier how the onus comes on the civil society and we have to do more to convince the government. But if we put that aside, what can we as individuals do for those that we see are in this distress and who are homeless in this situation?
I think so much of what we can do as human beings is essentially view people who are homeless, view people who are fleeing crisis as human at the end of the day. There have been a number of articles where civil society activists have come forward and asked homeless communities, what is it that we could do as everyday people, because every single person has the power to be able to do something. And it's small gestures, like being able to recognize that these people are your fellow human beings. It's a matter of circumstance that has led them to a situation where they no longer have a house above their head. And really, being able to shift our ideas and our ideology so that, we no longer see it as something that we just pay sympathy and compassion to, or we get awkward, when it comes to encountering someone homeless, really regarding them as an equal and as an individual who has simply faced terrible circumstances.
Definitely, and empathy is key here when we're dealing with those who are homeless without shelter. Thank you so much, Aamirah Patel, for talking to us. Dr. Melinda for joining us here in the studios. Mr. Gemenne for joining us. It was great talking to all of you guys, and it was a very insightful discussion. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.